The group of tourists was excited. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and they were visiting one of the most famous historical landmarks in the city. This particular place was well known for its impressive royal guards, who stood motionless at their posts, dressed in full regalia. They were a part of the country's history, guarding the royal palace and all its treasures. The guards were serious, professional, and unshakable. To most people, they were a symbol of honor and pride, representing centuries of tradition. Among the group of tourists was a young man named Mark, who had always been a little more daring than his friends. Mark loved to joke around, and was always the one to come up with ideas that pushed the limits. As they walked past the royal guards, Mark noticed that one of them was standing particularly still, his eyes forward, looking straight ahead with no movement. He got an idea, a mischievous thought that would make his friends laugh. "Imagine if I could take his weapon," Mark said with a smirk, turning to his friends. "It would be the best prank ever. I bet we could get away with it." His friends hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea, but Mark was already starting to walk toward the guard. He had a confident smile on his face, almost like he was preparing to do something he had done 100 times before. The others reluctantly followed him, unsure of what to expect. As Mark approached the guard, he took a deep breath and extended his hand toward the guard's weapon. The guard stood completely still, not flinching or moving a muscle. Mark reached out slowly, making sure no one was paying attention. His heart raced with excitement, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how daring he was being. With one quick motion, he grabbed the weapon from the guard's side, thinking it would be a funny, harmless prank. At first, everything felt fine. Mark's friends burst out laughing, thinking the whole thing was hilarious. They couldn't believe that Mark had actually pulled it off. They waited for the guard's reaction, expecting him to react in some way, maybe to yell at them, or at least show surprise. But nothing happened. The guard didn't even blink. He remained frozen in place, his posture stiff and unyielding. But that's when things began to change. A feeling of unease started to settle over Mark. The laughter from his friends began to fade as the guard stood there, unshaken, and started to look more serious. The laughter that had filled the air now felt uncomfortable, as though something was about to happen. Mark's fingers tightened around the weapon, and he noticed that a few people nearby had begun to stop and stare. A few seconds passed, but it felt like an eternity. The guard had not said a word, and Mark began to question if he had made a huge mistake. His heart started to race, not from excitement anymore, but from anxiety. He glanced around at his friends, who were still laughing, but now their smiles were a little more nervous. There was a sudden tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Mark realized too late that what seemed like a harmless prank was far more serious than he had imagined. The guard's silence was no longer funny. It felt ominous. And as the seconds stretched on, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he had just made a huge mistake. Would he get away with it? Or had he just crossed a line he shouldn't have? As Mark continued to hold the royal guard's weapon, the unease in the air grew stronger. His fingers felt clammy around the cold metal, and he suddenly realized that the situation was not as funny as he had thought. The guard stood completely still, his face emotionless, as though he were unaffected by Mark's actions. But there was something about the way the guard was standing now, his posture even more rigid, that sent a chill down Mark's spine. For a moment, everything was silent. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel his palms starting to sweat. His friends, who had been laughing only moments ago, had stopped. They stood a little farther away now, shifting uneasily from foot to foot, unsure of what to do. The light-hearted atmosphere that had surrounded them was gone, replaced by a sense of tension. Mark realized that the crowd around them had started to notice, and a few people were now watching with interest, murmuring amongst themselves. The guard had not moved an inch. Mark was beginning to feel a sense of dread creeping over him. What if this wasn't a harmless prank? What if he was about to get into trouble for something serious? His thoughts raced, and he briefly considered putting the weapon back, But it was too late for that. He could feel eyes on him. And the more he stood there, the more he realized how much he had underestimated the situation. Just as Mark was about to say something, the guard's hand moved. It was quick, almost like a reflex, and before Mark could react, the guard spoke in a low, commanding voice. "Give that back," he said, his tone calm but firm. There was no anger in the guard's voice, but something about the way he spoke made it clear that Mark had crossed a line. The sound of the guard's voice was enough to snap Mark out of his daze. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced. What now? Was the guard going to call for help? Mark had been expecting some kind of playful response, not this serious, intense reaction. His friends were now standing farther back, looking at him with wide eyes. They were no longer laughing. For a split second, Mark hesitated. His fingers still gripped the weapon, but his mind was in chaos. He had no idea how to get out of this. He had thought it would be fun, but now he realized he had made a serious mistake. The silence around him was deafening, and Mark suddenly felt very small and out of place. The guard's voice broke through his thoughts again, and this time it was more forceful. "Now," he said, stepping forward with a sharp, deliberate movement. Mark's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly handed the weapon back to the guard, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over him. But the guard didn't immediately take the weapon back. Instead, he stood there, his eyes locked onto Mark's, assessing him. Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What had started as a joke now felt like a serious offense. His mind raced, wondering if he was about to face consequences that he hadn't even imagined. The guard's unyielding stare made it clear that he wasn't taking this lightly, and Mark realized that the prank had backfired in the worst possible way. Mark stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The guard's unwavering gaze felt like it could see right through him. It was no longer a joke, and the reality of the situation hit Mark all at once. His fingers were still tingling from holding the weapon, but now he couldn't get rid of the sinking feeling in his stomach. He had thought it would be funny, something to make his friends laugh and impress them. But now, he could feel how serious the situation had become. The guard stood silently in front of him, not a muscle twitching. His posture was as straight and firm as ever. Mark glanced at his friends, who were now standing back, looking at him with nervous expressions. There was no laughter anymore. They were all watching, waiting for what would happen next. The weight of their eyes made Mark feel smaller and smaller. It was like the world had suddenly become much bigger than him, and he realized how much of a fool he had been. Mark's mouth felt dry as he tried to come up with something to say, anything to ease the tension, but the words didn't come. The guard remained silent, his expression as serious as ever. For a moment, there was no sound except the low murmur of people around them, noticing what was happening. Mark shifted uncomfortably, feeling the heat of embarrassment rise to his face. He had never felt so out of place. Then the guard spoke again, but this time, his voice was even more intense. "This is not a game. You cannot touch the weapon," he said. His tone wasn't angry, but there was no mistaking the authority in his words. It was clear that he had dealt with situations like this before. Mark felt his knees weaken slightly as he took a deep breath and nodded. His mind was racing. How had he gotten himself into this mess? Why hadn't he just listened to that little voice in his head telling him to leave the guard alone? The tourist crowd around them seemed to shrink, their eyes moving from Mark to the guard. The air felt thick, charged with the tension of the moment. Mark's stomach churned as he realized that what had started as a simple prank could now lead to serious consequences. He had always heard stories about tourists who ran into trouble when they disrespected local customs, but he had never thought it would happen to him. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The guard was still holding his ground, his eyes never leaving Mark. Mark felt like he was in a trance, as if he couldn't move or speak. He was waiting for something, anything, to break the tension, but the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. He knew he had made a huge mistake, but he wasn't sure what would happen next. Would the guard report him? Would he be arrested? Would he be thrown out of the area? The silence was deafening. Mark's friends, now looking uncomfortable, didn't know what to do either. One of them whispered something, but Mark couldn't make it out. His focus was entirely on the guard, who hadn't moved a muscle. Then, finally, the guard broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "You will need to come with me," he said. Mark's heart dropped. It was clear now that the situation had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. As the guard spoke, Mark's heart skipped a beat. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than anything he had heard before. "You will need to come with me." The calm authority in the guard's voice made it clear that this wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Mark's stomach tightened, and a wave of panic rushed over him. He had been expecting to be laughed at, or maybe scolded, but he had never imagined it would go this far. Now he stood there, feeling trapped, with no idea what to do next. The guard took a step closer, his uniform pristine, and his posture rigid. The tourist crowd around them had grown, and a few people were already whispering to each other, their eyes on Mark. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, and it made him feel even more out of place. He glanced at his friends, who looked just as nervous as he felt. They stood there, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Some were still in shock, others shaking their heads, but none of them moved to intervene. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The guard hadn't raised his voice, hadn't become angry, but the situation was quickly spiraling into something much more serious than he had imagined. Mark opened his mouth to say something, anything, to explain or apologize, but no words came out. It was as if his throat had gone dry, and he couldn't find the courage to speak. He had never thought he'd be in a situation like this. The guard's gaze never wavered, and Mark realized that there was no way out of this. The authority in the guard's eyes was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about the weapon anymore. It was about respect. Mark had disrespected the role of the guard, someone who was trained to protect and uphold tradition. What he had thought would be a harmless prank had become a serious breach of protocol. The realization hit him hard. With no other option, Mark slowly nodded. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but it seemed like his only choice. He took a hesitant step forward, his legs shaky, his mind racing. He glanced back at his friends, who were now visibly worried. They knew there was no turning back. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances, while others appeared ready to apologize on Mark's behalf, though none of them dared to speak up. Mark could sense their discomfort, but it was clear that they were just as helpless as he was. The guard turned and began walking, and Mark followed behind, still trying to process what was happening. As they walked toward a more secluded area, Mark couldn't help but feel the eyes of the crowd on him. He could hear the murmurs, the soft gasps from people who had witnessed what had happened. He felt exposed and small, like he was being paraded through the scene of his own mistake. The guard led him to a nearby security office, where a few more officers were waiting. Mark's steps felt heavy as he approached the door, his mind filled with 1,000 questions. What would happen to him now? Was he going to get into trouble? Would he be thrown out of the area? The worst part was the uncertainty. He had no idea what the consequences might be. The guard spoke briefly to the officers, who nodded in acknowledgement. They didn't look angry, but their serious expressions made it clear that this wasn't a situation they could just brush off. Mark felt a knot in his stomach. He knew he had done something wrong, but it hadn't hit him fully until now. The severity of the whole situation. He was in trouble, and all he could do was wait and hope that the consequences wouldn't be as harsh as he feared. Mark stood in the small security office, his hands sweating, his thoughts racing. He felt like he was in a dream, everything moving too fast for him to process. The officers didn't seem angry, but the serious look on their faces made it clear that this wasn't something to take lightly. The air was thick with tension, and Mark could feel his heart thudding in his chest as he waited for what would happen next. The guard who had first approached him was standing by the door, arms crossed, his gaze never leaving Mark. He didn't say anything more, but his presence alone was enough to make Mark feel even more nervous. Mark wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. There was no way to take back what he had done, and the realization of how foolish he had been washed over him. He had underestimated how seriously the guards took their role. The officers began speaking to each other in low voices, but Mark couldn't make out the words. His eyes darted between them, trying to figure out what was going to happen to him. His thoughts kept replaying the moment when he had grabbed the weapon, the laughter that followed, and the sudden shift when the guard had demanded it back. It all seemed so simple at first, but now, in the quiet of the security office, it felt like a huge mistake. He wasn't sure if he was in trouble with the local authorities, or if this would be something he could simply walk away from with a warning. One of the officers finally turned to him and spoke, breaking the silence. "You're lucky this isn't being treated as a more serious offense," he said in a calm voice, though there was a firmness behind his words. Mark's heart skipped. He had no idea how serious it could have been. The officer continued, explaining that taking a royal guard's weapon was not just disrespectful, it was a violation of tradition and law. Mark felt his face flush as the weight of the officer's words sank in. He had no idea that his joke could cause so much trouble. "You will be escorted out of the area," the officer added. "This is a warning. Next time, it might not be so lenient." Mark could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had been expecting a fine, maybe even a reprimand, but this felt different. He had never imagined that something so small could escalate so quickly. The officer turned to the guard, who had been silently watching the entire exchange. The guard nodded, and the two of them spoke quietly for a moment. Mark's mind was spinning. All he wanted now was to leave, to escape the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his chest. He had thought the prank would be a funny story to tell his friends later, but now it was a situation he would never forget. The guard finally turned to Mark. "Come with me," he said simply. Mark nodded, his feet feeling heavier with each step. The last thing he wanted was to make this worse, but it seemed like the best thing to do was follow the guard's instructions. He could feel his friends' eyes on him as he walked past them, and though they didn't say anything, Mark knew they were just as uncomfortable as he was. He wished he could make the situation better, but there was nothing he could do now except accept the consequences. As they left the security office, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief that the situation wasn't worse. Still, the embarrassment and guilt weighed on him. He had learned a hard lesson. Some things aren't funny, and some pranks go way too far. He would never forget the look in the guard's eyes, or the way his joke had turned into something far more serious. As Mark was escorted out of the security office, he couldn't help but replay everything that had happened in his mind. He had never felt so embarrassed in his life. The situation had started off so harmlessly, just a playful prank with his friends, but now it was something far bigger. The guard, who had once seemed like nothing more than part of the scenery, now felt like a symbol of authority that Mark had foolishly underestimated. His footsteps felt heavier with each step, and his mind was racing with questions he didn't have answers to. What would happen now? Would he be banned from the site? Would this be something he could laugh about later, or would it be a memory that haunted him forever? The guard led him through the area, past the crowd of onlookers who had gathered when Mark first grabbed the weapon. He could feel their eyes on him, and though no one said anything, the quiet whispers and stares were enough to make him feel even worse. Mark had never been one to shy away from attention, but this kind of attention felt different, like he was being judged for a mistake he hadn't known he was making. As they reached the exit of the guarded area, the guard paused for a moment. He didn't look angry, but his stern expression hadn't softened. Mark wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. It felt like everything he said would sound too late, as if it wouldn't matter anymore. The moment had passed, and now all he could do was face the consequences of his actions. He stood there, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, waiting for the next words from the guard. The guard finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I trust this won't happen again," he said. Mark nodded quickly, feeling the weight of the words. He had crossed a line, and though he didn't fully understand the depth of his mistake at the time, he knew now how serious it had been. "You've been given a warning," the guard continued. "Next time, it could be much worse. Understand?" Mark nodded again, more slowly this time. He didn't want to risk saying anything that might make the situation worse. The guard's expression remained serious, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, almost as if he were giving Mark a chance to learn from the experience. Mark felt a little relieved, but he also knew that this wasn't something he could just brush off. He had made a mistake, and it had consequences. The guard stepped aside and motioned for Mark to leave. "Go. And remember, this place is a place of respect. Always," he said. Mark didn't hesitate. He stepped past the guard, feeling the cool air outside brush against his face as he left the guarded area. He was now standing on the edge of a public space, with his friends waiting a little further down the path. Their faces were a mix of concern and awkwardness, but Mark didn't look at them just yet. He needed a moment to think. Taking a deep breath, Mark sat down on a bench nearby. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and his mind was spinning. What had he been thinking? It had seemed like such a harmless joke, but now it felt so foolish. He glanced up at the majestic building in front of him. The very same building where he had just crossed a line. It was a place of history, tradition, and respect, and he had violated that with a single impulsive action. Mark realized that this wasn't just about a prank. It was about understanding the role of others, the importance of respect, and the weight that certain actions could carry. As his friends slowly approached, Mark could tell they were unsure of how to respond. They had been part of the prank too, but none of them had expected it to go this far. They had been caught up in the excitement, but now they were just as uncomfortable as he was. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew that they were all thinking the same thing. Mark had learned a hard lesson, and it was a lesson he wouldn't forget anytime soon. Mark sat quietly on the bench, his thoughts swirling as he watched the scene in front of him. The peaceful surroundings, the tall buildings, and the flow of people all seemed so normal. But to him, everything felt off. The events of the past hour kept playing on a loop in his mind. He had made a joke, a harmless prank, but now it felt like a mistake so big it might define the rest of his day. His friends gathered around him, unsure of what to say. None of them had expected things to escalate like this. At first, they had laughed. They thought Mark's prank was just another joke, something to remember, maybe even something to tell people about later. But now, standing at the edge of the royal grounds, they could feel the weight of the situation. Mark had been taken away by the guard, escorted through the area with that stern look on his face, and the tension that followed still hung in the air. The guards had been calm, but the seriousness of their actions made it clear that Mark had done something wrong, and everyone could feel it. Mark glanced up at his friends, noticing the nervous expressions on their faces. They weren't laughing anymore. The carefree energy from before had completely vanished. "I'm sorry, guys," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't think it would be this serious." One of his friends, Jake, gave him a sympathetic look. "We didn't think so either, Mark. But that guard, he was serious. You could see it in his eyes." Another friend, Laura, nodded. "I've never seen anything like that before. It wasn't just a prank for them. I think we all learned a big lesson today." Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. He felt like a fool. How had he not seen this coming? The guard had stood so still, so professional. Mark had thought he could get away with a joke. But in the end, he had crossed a line that he hadn't even known existed. The seriousness of the situation had only hit him after the guard's stern warning and the quiet walk to the security office. He had felt like the entire world was watching him, and he hadn't known how to make it stop. For a moment, Mark didn't speak. He needed time to absorb everything that had happened, to really understand the consequences of his actions. What started as a playful challenge had turned into a close call, and now he realized how lucky he was that the situation hadn't escalated further. He could have been in real trouble. His thoughts drifted to what could have happened if the guard had decided to call for backup, or if the authorities had taken things even more seriously. But as the minutes passed, Mark began to feel a small sense of relief. He wasn't arrested, and they hadn't been banned from the area. He had been given a warning, which meant that the situation wasn't as bad as it could have been. Still, it wasn't a situation he would want to repeat. "I guess we were lucky," Mark said finally, looking up at his friends. "It could have gone a lot worse. I just wish I had thought before I acted." The others nodded, and the silence stretched between them for a moment. There wasn't much more to say, but they all knew that this experience would stick with them for a long time. It wasn't just about respecting the guards or the traditions. It was about understanding how actions, no matter how small they seemed, could have consequences. Mark had learned that lesson the hard way, and he was never going to forget it. As they slowly made their way out of the area, Mark felt a bit of weight lift off his shoulders. He had learned something important today, and although the memory of the guard's serious face would stay with him, it would also be a reminder to be more mindful in the future. This wasn't a lesson he would let slip away. As Mark and his friends walked away from the royal grounds, the weight of the situation slowly began to lift, but it still lingered in the back of his mind. The tension he had felt earlier, the nervousness of being in trouble, hadn't completely gone away. The group remained quiet for a few moments, each of them reflecting on what had just happened. It wasn't until they reached a nearby cafe that the conversation started again. Mark sat down at a table, the others following suit. He could feel the eyes of his friends on him, but they weren't filled with judgment. There was an understanding between them. They had all seen how quickly things could go from a harmless joke to something much more serious, and they all knew that Mark hadn't meant any harm. Still, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had put everyone in an awkward position, and the weight of that still rested on his shoulders. "So, what do you think?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of curiosity in it. "That was intense, right?" Mark chuckled weakly. "Yeah, that's one way to put it. I never thought a simple prank could turn into something like that. I honestly thought the guard would just laugh it off or yell at me or something, but I didn't realize how serious they take their job." Laura nodded in agreement. "It's kind of crazy how something that seemed so harmless can turn into a huge deal. I think we all learned that respect matters, especially when it comes to things like tradition and culture." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "I feel dumb. I really do. It was supposed to be a joke, but now I see how important it is to respect other people's roles and customs. It's not just about having fun. It's about understanding boundaries." He paused for a moment, reflecting. "I mean, I didn't even know the history behind those royal guards. I didn't know how much they meant to the people here. I took it all for granted." "Yeah, I get it now too," Jake said, nodding. "When we first saw the guards, we didn't think twice. We just saw a chance for a prank. But the seriousness of it all really hit home today." Mark looked out the window, his thoughts wandering. "I guess that's the thing about travel, right? You see all these cool places and interesting things, but you never really understand the depth of it until you're there and you experience it firsthand. It's easy to forget that you're not in your own world. You're in someone else's." The group sat quietly for a few moments, each of them digesting Mark's words. There was no need to rush the conversation. They all understood the lesson learned, and it was clear that the experience had been a turning point. It wasn't just about the guard or the prank. It was about understanding respect and how small actions could have big consequences. After a while, Mark broke the silence again. "You know, I'm actually kind of grateful it didn't go worse. We could have gotten in real trouble." He paused, a small smile forming on his face. "It's a good reminder to think before I act. And I'm definitely not going to pull any more pranks like that again." Laura laughed softly. "Yeah, maybe stick to safer jokes next time. Nothing that involves royal guards and weapons." Mark chuckled. "Agreed. I've learned my lesson." As they finished their drinks and began to gather their things, Mark felt a sense of closure starting to form. The tension from earlier had melted away, but the lesson would stay with him. He'd never forget how quickly a joke could turn serious, and how important it was to understand and respect the culture and traditions of the places he visited. Mark knew he would always carry this experience with him, and he felt a sense of maturity settling in. What had started as a prank had turned into an unforgettable lesson, one that he would never take lightly again.